On the night when South Africa tried to crush his movement, when police sirens screamed through the dark streets of Johannesburg and files with his name were stamped banned, Oliver Tambo was not holding a gun or giving an angry speech. He was sitting at a small wooden desk, far away, painstakingly drawing a triangle on a scrap of paper, whispering the same quiet sentence he'd believed since he was a boy in a mud hut. If I can prove it, they can't deny it forever. That is the paradox of Oliver Tambo. The man who would help bring down apartheid did it with the mind of a mathematician, the patience of a village schoolteacher, and a rivalry that pushed him to the edge of safety, time and time again. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a round hut in the rolling green hills of Ponderland on a cold morning in October 1917. The first thing that greeted him was not a hospital, but the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. The baby, Oliver Reginald Tambo, was born on a grass mat, the wind slipping through the cracks of the hut, his mother Julia wrapping him in a blanket that had seen better days. Outside, the hills were peaceful. Inside, the future of a continent had just cried for the first time. His father, Mzimeni, was a man of tradition and stubborn pride, not rich, not powerful, but respected in the small community near the village of Kantolo. To the young Oliver, his father seemed like a giant. He heard his voice in the evenings, deep and steady, as men gathered around the fire to talk of cattle, land disputes, and the laws of white magistrates that no one in the circle had been asked to write. As a child, Oliver watched something that would shape him for life. Adults who had no say in the rules that governed them, but who still argued about what was fair. In that space between silence and protest, he learned to listen. The boy was quiet, not weak, not fearful, but quiet in the way of someone who is always measuring the room. He would sit close to the doorway, eyes wide, while his older brothers played. When other children wrestled outside in the dust, Oliver drew shapes with a stick. Circles, lines, clumsy little squares. Nobody in the village called it geometry, but the lines had to meet, the circle had to close. Even then, he wanted the world to make sense. One evening, when he was about 7, he saw his first real conflict. A neighbor burst into their yard, angry and desperate. His small strip of land was being taken, he said, reallocated under new white regulations, drawn up miles away. He had done nothing wrong. Yet tomorrow, men with papers would come and tell him his home was no longer his. Oliver watched his father listen, then stand up slowly, his face tight. The men spoke in low voices, naming magistrates, chiefs, colonial officials. At the edge of the circle, the boy felt the air change. The injustice was real, right there, in their yard. But the power to stop it lived somewhere else, in offices his people would never see. By morning, the neighbor's land was gone. That day, something silently snapped into place in Oliver's mind. Unfairness was not just a feeling, it was a system, drawn in ink, signed with a pen. Calculated. If it was calculated, perhaps it could be uncalculated. School in this world was a luxury. For many black children in rural South Africa, education ended before it truly began. Some never saw a classroom, others sat 3 to a bench, sharing tattered books designed to keep them obedient, not enlightened. But Oliver's mother believed that her son's silence was not emptiness. It was depth. When a Catholic mission school opened within walking distance, a long, exhausting walk, but still a walk, she insisted he go. The building was nothing impressive. Simple wooden walls, a few broken windows, a dusty yard. But to Oliver, it was a portal. On the first day, he held a slate in his hands like treasure. Chalk dust rose like white smoke as he traced letters he did not yet understand. He learned to write his name, Oliver, 9 strokes of the hand that made him more real in the eyes of a world that had never asked who he was. He walked for hours each day to that mission school, through mud, rain, and burning sun. He went barefoot at first, feet toughened by the ground. On some mornings, his stomach clawed with hunger, yet he went. Teachers noticed a strange persistence in this quiet boy from Kantolo. He did not joke in class or fight in the yard. He simply watched, listened, and did his work meticulously, as though each correct answer was another small nail securing his place in a world that might otherwise throw him away. Then came the first twist. A priest from the school visited the Tambo household. He had heard enough. This boy had to go further. There was a place, he said, where black children could get a better education. Holy Cross Mission, near Flagstaff. It was still poor, still limited by racist laws, but compared to Kantolo, it was a universe. However, it was also far away. Oliver would have to leave home. The boy sat in the flickering light of the fire as his parents talked. To him, leaving meant more than distance. It meant stepping into a world where his father's protection could not reach, where the rules would be written entirely by others. There was another complication. Money. The family did not have it. For most children in his village, this would have been the end of the story. But Oliver had that quiet stubbornness. He began doing odd jobs, helping neighbors, giving up small comforts. He walked whenever possible, saving every coin. His parents sacrificed. The community chipped in. Piece by piece, a path was carved out of nothing. When he finally arrived at Holy Cross, he stepped into a shock. Here, so many talented black children were crammed into one place that his safe identity as the clever boy from Kantolo vanished overnight. In its place, a new landscape, competition, and with it, the person who would become the first real rival of his life. His name in this story is Vusi Khumalo. Sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, already a leader among the students. Unlike Oliver, Vusi loved attention. He spoke loudly, laughed loudly, argued loudly. He wanted to be first in everything. First in class, first in football, first to answer the priest's questions. When Oliver answered a difficult math problem correctly, Vusi was there the next day, answering faster. When Oliver studied late in the dormitory, he would glance up and see Vusi watching him with a half-smile that said silently, "We'll see who wins." It was not a gentle rivalry, it was flint against stone. The two boys were competing for more than grades. They both understood, on some deep level, that in a country bent on keeping them down, excellence was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Scholarships went to the top. Opportunities went to the top. Survival went to the top. And the staircase out of poverty had very few steps. Oliver did not become louder to match Vusi. He doubled down on being precise, disciplined, relentless. He would copy notes until his fingers cramped. In geometry, he found something like peace. The logic of angles and lines, pure and indifferent to skin color. A triangle didn't care who drew it. A theorem didn't change if a black boy proved it. But outside the classroom, the world cared very much. On a visit to a nearby town, the boys had their first brutal lesson in what waited for them beyond the mission gates. They approached a shop together, laughing about a football match. A white policeman stopped them. Two boys, same age, same uniforms. "Step off the pavement," he snapped. In that moment, Vusi, the loud one, the competitor, froze. Oliver, the quiet one, looked the man in the eye for just a second too long. It wasn't open defiance. It was a question, hanging in the air. The policeman's hand shot out and grabbed Oliver by the collar, yanking him forward hard enough to choke. In a flash, the friendly street turned into a place of danger. Threats, spit, the sharp smack of a baton against a post, inches from his head, a promise of what would happen if he ever forgot his place again. When he was released, coughing, Vusi pulled him aside, voice shaking with anger. Do you want to die in a ditch for staring? He hissed. Be clever, Tambo. Use your head. Pass their exams. Beat them that way. It was the first time their rivalry transformed into something deeper. A disagreement about strategy. Two visions of survival clashed for the first time. Vusi believed in outscoring the system from within. Oliver was beginning to sense that some systems could not be outscored. They had to be overturned. Holy Cross led to St. Peter's Secondary School in Johannesburg. That move was like crossing a border between worlds. The rural boy arrived in the city, where gold mines glowed in the distance, and black workers were herded into cramped townships under harsh regulations. The city exposed numbers that hit him harder than any baton. By the time he was a young student, South Africa was already spending several times more on a white child's education than on a black child's. A white classroom might have 20 pupils, new textbooks, electricity. A black classroom could be overflowing. Students sharing chairs, learning from hand-me-down materials meant to keep them in their place. Oliver walked past manicured lawns where white children played, then returned to St. Peter's, where everything was thinner. The soup, the blankets, the chances of a future. There, another twist awaited him. If Holy Cross had introduced him to competition, St. Peter's introduced him to injustice with a name: politics. He began to hear words whispered in corridors. Pass laws, segregation, African National Congress. Posters appeared, then disappeared. Older students gathered in corners, speaking low and fast, glancing over their shoulders. One evening, a priest's radio, a rare thing, crackled with news of new restrictions. Certain areas declared white only. Black families pushed out. Passbooks tightened. People arrested not for what they had done, but for where they dared to stand. The young mathematician found himself dragged, slowly, into a different kind of calculation. How many people could be arrested before resistance erupted? How many laws could be written before someone stood up and said no more? And what if that someone had to be him? Vusi was there too. The rival had made his way to Johannesburg on his own path, a familiar face in an unfamiliar city. Their competition resumed like a fire that had only been smoldering. Now, however, the stakes included more than marks. Vusi argued that their best revenge was success. Good jobs, respectable positions, beating the white system at its own game. We don't have time for dreams of uprising, he told Oliver one night as they walked past barbed wire fences. Look around. They have guns. We have schoolbooks. Don't throw that away. Time. The word hit Oliver harder than he expected, because time was the one thing no one could hoard, no matter how wealthy or powerful. Every day, new racist laws appeared. Every year, more children grew up under a tighter cage, and two brilliant black students, Tambo and Kumalo, were debating whether they had time to do anything about it before the bars closed completely. When Oliver earned a place at the University College of Fort Hare, it felt like stepping onto the upper floor of a burning building. Fort Hare was the crown jewel of black higher education in South Africa, the place where a handful of African students could study, alongside a small number of Indians and colored students under suffocating constraints, but with glimpses of the world beyond. It was a factory for the future elite, and a pressure cooker. He arrived just as global and local tensions were spiraling. The Second World War had shaken the planet. Colonial empires trembled. In South Africa, young black intellectuals were asking dangerous questions. If Europeans could fight for freedom from fascism, why could Africans not fight for freedom from racist rule? At Fort Hare, Oliver expected more of the same. Quiet study, bitter awareness, private anger. Instead, he found something volatile. Students were forming debating societies and political groups. They argued fiercely about Africa's future in crowded dorm rooms, voices rising late into the night. Some believed in gradual reform, others demanded radical change. Many were terrified of both. Oliver, by instinct, moved towards reasoned debate, careful argument, patient persuasion. His love for mathematics shaped his approach. Define the problem, test assumptions, build a solution, step by logical step. But in the benches of lecture halls and on the lawns after class, he met a new kind of energy. Restless, impatient, almost explosive. And he met it again in Vusi. His old rival had also made it to Fort Hare. By now, Vusi was not just a competitor in class. He was running for student leadership, making fiery speeches about dignity and discipline. He promised to represent the students to the administration, to negotiate hard, but keep the peace. Respectability was his shield. "You're good with arguments," Vusi told Oliver one evening. "Join my side, help me win. We'll work with the system, not against it. We don't have time to waste on impossible revolutions." That night, Oliver lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. It was 1942. The winds of World War were howling across Europe and Asia. Men his age were dying in trenches thousands of kilometers away. But in the quiet corridors of Fort Hare, a different deadline was ticking. The University Council, under pressure from the white authorities, was tightening rules on student activities. Political meetings were being monitored. Radical voices were being warned. There were rumors that anyone who made too much trouble would be expelled. And in those days, expulsion could mean the end of a black student's entire future. Time was short. Within weeks, perhaps days, decisions would be taken that could silence a generation of young African intellectuals. Oliver faced a brutal equation. If he sided with Vusi, he might secure a respectable place, a teacher, a professional, maybe even a small measure of influence. If he sided with more radical students, he could lose everything he had worked for since the days of chalk on a slate in Cantolo. But if he stayed silent, he would be cooperating with a system that had slapped him off a pavement, stolen his neighbor's land, starved his classmates of books, and treated his people like a problem to be managed, not human beings with a future. Then came the spark. The university announced a new rule. Students had to sign a declaration accepting the authority of the college and promising not to engage in subversive political activity. Those who refused would not be allowed to re-register. It was effectively a loyalty oath to the system that kept them down. The campus erupted. Meetings were called. The clock was merciless. They had a fixed number of days, just a handful, to decide whether to sign and stay or refuse and risk everything. The administration set a date. Midnight on that date, the books would close. Vusi called for caution. "We sign now, we fight later," he argued. "We need more time. They hold all the cards. Give me 2 years with a degree, and then we'll talk." Others demanded immediate resistance. "If we bow now," they said, "we'll bow forever. There is no later for people like us." Oliver, the quiet boy from Cantolo, the competitor at Holy Cross, the careful scholar of Fort Hare, found himself in the middle of a storm where neither side felt fully right, and there was no way to calculate a safe answer. He had hours to choose. By the end of that year, a decision in a small college in a racially segregated country would set him on a path that would carry him into courtrooms, secret meetings, and the leadership of a liberation movement in exile. But in that moment, all of that was invisible. All he knew was this: the rival who had chased him in classrooms for years was standing on one side of the line, promising safety and time. On the other side was a step into economic uncertainty, political danger, and a life that could end in prison, or worse. As the deadline approached and the shadows lengthened over Fort Hare's lawns, Oliver Tambo straightened his shoulders, thinking of his father by the fire, his mother pushing him out the door to school, the policeman's hand on his collar, the neighbor's land stolen with ink. The hour was late. The choice could not be postponed any longer. At midnight, when the deadline finally hit, the quiet lawns of Fort Hare felt like a courtroom. In one building, the university registers lay open, waiting like traps. A line of students shuffled forward, some angry, some resigned, each one given the same choice. Sign the declaration and keep your place, or walk away into uncertainty. Oliver stood in the doorway, hands cold, heart hammering. His name on the list, a pen on the table, a clock on the wall. Behind him, the corridor buzzed with whispers. Ahead of him, the registrar barely looked up. Another black student, another signature, another safe, obedient future. From the side of the room, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Tambo. Vusi stood there, already signed in, a small black mark next to his name, one stroke of ink that protected his degree, his prospects, his future. It's just a sentence, Vusi said quietly. You sign, you finish. You get your qualification, your job, your influence. Then you fight, on your terms, with time on your side. Time. Always time. But Oliver was staring at the document. The words were simple, bureaucratic, colorless, yet they meant this. I accept your authority. I will not disturb your peace. Images flashed behind his eyes. His neighbor's land, stolen with a pen. The policeman's hand on his collar. The children in overcrowded classrooms. The future slammed shut with a signature. His hand did move, but not towards the pen. He straightened up. I won't sign, he said. For a second, it was almost comical. A polite sentence dropped into a quiet room. A registrar blinking in annoyance. Vusi stiffening, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Then the registrar's face hardened. You understand the consequences? He asked. Oliver nodded. His mouth was dry. You will be expelled, the man said. No readmission. No completion of your degree. Think carefully, Mr. Tambo. The world out there is not kind to men with no qualifications. The world in here, Oliver thought, is not kind to men who kneel. I understand, he replied. He turned and walked out, feeling every step like it was echoing down a tunnel. Somewhere behind him, someone sighed. Somewhere ahead of him, someone whispered. He refused. The word spread like a small, dangerous fire. By the end of that week, it wasn't just Oliver. Dozens of students refused to sign. The administration responded with cold precision. Expulsions were not dramatic. No police charge, no sirens. Just letters delivered, names removed, doors closed. Oliver packed his belongings into a small suitcase. Books, a few clothes, a worn Bible. No degree, no certificate, no promise of employment. He met Vusi one last time at the edge of the campus, next to a dusty road that led back into the country he had just defied. You've thrown it away, Vusi said, eyes blazing. Do you know how long it took us to claw our way here? Do you know how many never even got the chance? Oliver looked at him, tired and strangely calm. If we keep accepting their rules, he said softly, it will always be their time, not ours. Then we outsmart them, Vusi snapped, from inside. I'll get qualified. I'll get into their courts, their offices, their boards. I'll fight where it matters. And if the price is keeping quiet when they crush us? Oliver asked. Vusi had no answer. Or maybe he had too many. He just shook his head, angry and afraid. Afraid not just for Oliver, but of what Oliver's choice said about his own. The rivalry that had been about marks and rankings shifted, without either of them saying it aloud. From that day on, their competition would not be about who got the best exam scores. It would be about something far more dangerous, whose strategy for survival, resistance, and dignity would shape the future. Oliver walked away from Fort Hare, feeling like he was stepping off the edge of a cliff. The ground he landed on was rough. Back in Kantolo, there were no speeches, no celebration, just disappointment that could not be hidden. His family had sacrificed for years, and now the son who was supposed to make it had come home with empty hands. What will you do now? His father asked one evening, sitting by the fire, shadows flickering across his lined face. "I don't know," Oliver admitted, "but I know why I left." His father stared into the flames for a long time. "A hungry man cannot eat principles," he said at last. "But a man who has no principles is already starving." It was not approval. It was not condemnation. It was something in between. Something heavy. Responsibility. Word reached Johannesburg that Fort Hare had expelled a polite, disciplined student who refused to sign a loyalty oath. In a small but interconnected world of black clergy and teachers, that news mattered. An invitation came. St. Peter's, the mission school that had once sharpened his mind, needed teachers. The boy who had walked barefoot to a mission classroom returned through the gates as a young man in a worn suit, a book under his arm. The rooms were still cramped, the resources still scarce. But this time, he stood at the front. He saw in the faces of his students the same hunger he had felt, to understand the world, to find a way out. Some of them would never make it beyond St. Peter's. A few might. The difference sometimes would be a single teacher who refused to accept that their fate was fixed. Oliver became that teacher. He prepared lessons until late at night, pages covered in neat handwriting, diagrams of triangles, circles, equations. He could not give his students more textbooks, more money, more political power, but he could give them something else, a sense that their minds were sharp weapons, not dull tools. Sometimes, when he drew figures on the board, he would pause, lost in thought. The chalk lines looked like maps, every angle a choice, every side a path. One afternoon, a visitor came to the school, slipping into the back of a classroom where Oliver was explaining a geometry proof. The man was older than him, broad-shouldered, with intense eyes that watched carefully. Walter Sisulu. After class, Sisulu introduced himself. He worked as an estate agent, but that title barely scratched the surface. He was a networker, a connector, a quiet engine inside the African National Congress, the organization Oliver had heard whisperings about at Fort Hare. "I've been told you're a good teacher," Sisulu said, "but this country needs more than teachers. It needs leaders who can think clearly and who know what they're willing to risk." Oliver listened as Sisulu described the ANC's history. Founded in 1912, petitions sent, deputations to London, polite appeals ignored by white governments that grew ever more brutal. He spoke of a new energy building among younger Africans, a belief that polite requests were finished. "You walked away from a degree for a principle," Sisulu said. "What will you walk towards?" The answer did not come overnight, but soon Oliver found himself in meetings that felt like the late-night debates at Fort Hare, only sharper, in small rooms thick with cigarette smoke and arguments. He met men who would change his life. Nelson Mandela, tall and charismatic. Anton Lembede, intense and uncompromising. Other young activists who were tired of waiting. They formed the ANC Youth League in 1944. On paper, it was a sub-organization, a junior wing. In reality, it was a spark. Oliver was elected the first national secretary. It sounded modest, administrative, but it meant he would be the one drafting documents, keeping structures together, turning passion into plans. Here, his mathematical mind found a new problem to solve: how to turn anger into strategy. The Youth League pushed for a program of action that demanded mass protests, strikes, civil disobedience. The elders in the ANC, many of them middle-class professionals, were cautious. "Our people will suffer," they warned. "The government will hit back hard." "They are already suffering," the Youth League replied, "and they are already being hit." Among the cautious voices, sometimes Oliver could almost hear Vusi. "We need time. We must get inside. We must not provoke." He saw Vusi occasionally in Johannesburg. The former rival was now moving comfortably through white offices. Respectable job, good suit, working within the system. He spoke about committees, advisory boards, interracial councils. "You're with the Youth League now?" Vusi asked one evening, raising an eyebrow. "Radicals shouting in the streets?" "Radicals writing plans," Oliver corrected, "and not just shouting." "And when the police come," Vusi asked softly, "when they arrest your students, your neighbors, will you be there or in a meeting writing another resolution?" The question stung because it hit something raw, the gap between vision and risk, but instead of backing down, Oliver dug deeper into planning, organizing, shaping. In 1952, the Youth League's ideas burst onto the streets. The Defiance Campaign began, carefully organized, non-violent resistance on a scale South Africa had never seen. Volunteers deliberately broke apartheid laws, entering whites-only railway stations, sitting on forbidden benches, walking through European entrances. Oliver, now a respected figure in the ANC, helped coordinate, strategize, keep the movement disciplined. He watched as ordinary men and women, nurses, factory workers, clergy, students, stepped forward to be arrested. The numbers were chilling. In 6 months, over 8,000 volunteers deliberately went to jail. Police vans overflowed. Prisons filled with people whose only crime was sitting on a bench, walking through a doorway, refusing to carry a racist pass. The government responded with new laws, new punishments. The Suppression of Communism Act gave them broad powers to ban organizations, imprison leaders, silence voices they found inconvenient. Oliver felt the circle tightening. One morning, a policeman arrived at his door with a small document that weighed more than any textbook, a banning order. He was forbidden from attending public meetings, forbidden from being quoted, forbidden from moving freely. His world shrank to prescribed areas, prescribed people, prescribed speech. His law practice with Mandela, South Africa's first black law firm, opened in 1952, became not just a workplace, but a refuge and a battleground. The office at Chancellor House was crowded with clients bruised by police, exhausted from past raids, desperate to avoid being thrown out of the city for a technical violation of a racist regulation. Women came straight from the street, children clinging to their skirts, papers clutched in shaking hands. Men arrived after night raids, eyes still wide from the glare of torches and the crack of rifle butts against doors. On the wall, calendars flipped. Time was not on their side. The machinery of apartheid was accelerating. Oliver and Mandela worked late into the night, drafting affidavits, challenging evictions, defending activists. Sometimes they won small victories. More often, the law simply revealed how deeply it had been corrupted. "Remember Fort Hare?" Mandela asked him once, smiling ruefully as they sat among stacks of files. "You refused to sign, they threw you out. That's what they do with anyone who doesn't play their game. So we changed the game." But changing the game carried a price. In 1956, the knock on the door was no longer just about banning orders or pass violations. Oliver was arrested with 155 others and charged with treason. The treason trial dragged on for years. From 1956 to 1961, he walked in and out of the courtroom, day after day, listening as prosecutors tried to paint the ANC and its allies as violent revolutionaries intent on overthrowing the state by force. In reality, most of what they presented as evidence were speeches, resolutions, programs calling for equal rights. Yet the charge of treason carried the possibility of death. The courtroom became a strange stage. Journalists from around the world came to watch. Accused men and women, some in traditional dress, some in suits, sat together on the benches, joking quietly during breaks, organizing, planning, turning a trial meant to break them into a school of solidarity. Outside, life went on. Laws tightened. Pass raids continued. The government hoped that by tying up so many leaders in court, they would weaken the movement. One day, during a break, Oliver caught sight of a familiar figure in the corridor. Vusi, now an advisor to a multiracial committee. Praised by some liberals, distrusted by many activists. They spoke briefly, awkwardly. "You could have been on the other side of this dock," Vusi said, glancing towards the courtroom where Oliver's co-accused were gathering. "A respected lawyer, a government advisor. You're too clever to be wasting your life being dragged from cell to courtroom and back again." "I am on the other side," Oliver replied. "The side that refuses to pretend this is normal." "You always choose the hardest road," Vusi muttered. "And you always choose the safest," Oliver said, more sharply than he intended. The rivalry now was no longer academic or personal. It was ideological. Two futures for South Africa were embodied in two men who had once raced to answer math questions in a mission classroom. In 1961, after years of exhausting legal battle, the accused in the treason trial were acquitted. Outside the courthouse, there was celebration. But it was thin, edged with fear, because while they had been in court, the country had changed again. The real explosion had already happened the year before, in a township south of Johannesburg called Sharpeville, March 21, 1960. Thousands of black South Africans gathered peacefully outside a police station, protesting the hated pass laws. Many carried nothing but their passbooks, offered up as symbols of the system that chained them. Police opened fire. In less than 2 minutes, 69 people lay dead. Some were shot in the back as they ran. Over 180 were wounded. The photographs that emerged, bodies on the ground, blood on the dust, shoes scattered where people had fled, were burned into the world's memory. For Oliver, Sharpeville was not just a tragedy, it was a brutal message. The regime would not hesitate to kill unarmed protesters in broad daylight. The government declared a state of emergency. Thousands were arrested. The ANC was banned outright. The legal path, already narrow, was collapsing. In secret meetings, the ANC's leadership grappled with a new equation. If they stayed, they faced imprisonment, banning, possible assassination. If they left, they could organize from outside, but they would be far from their people. Time now moved in days, not years. They needed someone to leave the country, immediately, to build international support, to keep the ANC alive beyond South Africa's borders before the prison doors clanged shut on all of them. They chose Oliver. It was not a glamorous appointment, no motorcades, no fanfare, just a quiet decision in a room with the curtains drawn. "You will be our voice outside," they told him. "You must persuade the world that we exist, that our cause is just, that we will not disappear. You must raise support, build alliances, hold us together." He had less than 24 hours to prepare. He packed a small case, a few clothes, some papers, addresses of contacts scribbled on scraps, a Bible, memories. He said goodbye to his family in hushed, urgent conversations. "When will you be back?" someone asked. He opened his mouth to answer and realized he had no idea. He slipped out of the country, not through a grand departure lounge, but across a border that glowed faintly in the desert darkness, heading first to Bechuanaland, now Botswana, then further, step by uncertain step, into exile. On one of those nights, waiting for transport in a small, dimly lit room, he sat at a table with a piece of paper and a pencil, the same way he had done as a boy in Kantolo, as a student at Holy Cross. He drew a triangle. One point, the people inside South Africa under attack. Second point, the exiled leadership, scattered and vulnerable. Third point, the outside world, powerful but distracted. He stared at it, feeling the weight of a ticking clock inside his chest. If he failed, the line between those 3 points would break. The ANC would fracture. The regime would tighten its grip. A generation's hope would be strangled. If he succeeded, the triangle might become something else, a structure strong enough to hold under pressure. Somewhere, he imagined, Vusi was sitting in a comfortable chair, perhaps in a committee meeting, still arguing that the safest path was the smartest, still believing there was more time. Oliver no longer believed that, on a cold morning, stepping off a plane into a foreign city, Dar es Salaam, then London, then other capitals he had only ever seen on maps, he felt the full scale of what had happened. He was not a student anymore, not just a teacher, not just a lawyer. He was a political exile with no certain way home, carrying in his worn suitcase the fragile future of a banned movement, a banned people, a banned dream. The boy from a mud hut in Ponderland, who once traced circles in the dust, now had to draw new lines across continents in languages he did not speak, persuading strangers who had never set foot on African soil that time was running out for his country. The rivalry with Vusi, the arguments about caution and speed, about safety and risk, now stretched across oceans. One man had chosen to live inside the system, trying to bend it gently. The other had stepped outside, forced into a race against time, with no guarantee he would live to see the finish line. And far away, back in South Africa, the clock of apartheid kept ticking, louder and louder, as if daring him to outrun it from thousands of kilometers away. The first time Oliver Tambo understood what exile really meant, it wasn't in an airport or a hotel. It was in a cramped room where the air smelled of paraffin and sweat, where a single candle threw a trembling light on a map of Africa, its borders drawn by strangers with rulers, as if human lives were geometry. He leaned over that map and realized a terrifying truth. A movement can be banned, a leader can be jailed, a country can be sealed, like a coffin, and the world will still go to sleep unless someone shakes it awake. And he had been given a deadline to do exactly that. Not someday, not when things calm down. He had 12 months, 1 year, before the ANC's networks inside South Africa would be smashed beyond recognition, before money dried up, before fear turned into silence. A year before the triangle, he'd sketched in his mind, people inside, leaders outside, world opinion snapped apart. The regime had guns and prisons. Oliver had a suitcase, a notebook, and a voice. And somewhere behind him, like a shadow with a polished smile, the old rival's logic followed him. Work inside the system. Be respectable. Be safe. Buy time. Oliver didn't have time. He arrived in Dar es Salaam to a government that was young and electric, the kind of place where independence wasn't a museum exhibit, it was a living fire. Tanzania, under Julius Nyerere, listened. Other newly independent African states listened too, but listening wasn't enough. Sympathy didn't stop police bullets. Speeches didn't feed detainees' families. Declarations didn't print underground pamphlets. Oliver discovered the first brutal rule of exile. You are always fundraising for someone else's survival while your own life is on hold. Then came the second rule. Exile is crowded with friends and full of competitors. In London, in conference rooms and church basements, he met men who introduced themselves as moderates, as realists, as reasonable Africans. They shook hands with officials who loved the sound of gradual change. They formed councils and committees that could be photographed. They wrote reports that could be politely archived. And there, in that same world of suits and committees, appeared Vusi, older now, smoother, connected. He wasn't ANC, he didn't have to be. He represented the competing strategy that haunted Oliver like a mirror. Reform through acceptance, influence through proximity to white power, negotiation without disruption. We can move them, Vusi said one evening after a reception, glass in hand, voice low. Not by screaming, by being credible, by making them see we're not a threat. Oliver watched diplomats laugh at jokes about Africa, watched them eat and nod and forget. He felt his jaw tighten. They already see us, Oliver replied. They just don't feel us. Vusi smiled as if Oliver were a talented child. Feeling is not policy. You need access. Oliver didn't argue. He was learning that in exile, you don't win debates. You win by building reality faster than the other side can deny it. So he started building. He moved like a man whose calendar was a fuse. Cairo, Accra, Lagos, Algiers, Stockholm, Moscow, Delhi. Everywhere, the pitch was the same. But it had to be reshaped for each room. To African leaders, he spoke as one of them. Apartheid was colonialism's last fortress. To Scandinavians, he spoke in moral arithmetic. Neutrality in the face of apartheid was cooperation. To the Eastern Bloc, he spoke the language of power. South Africa was a Western-backed outpost. Help us crack it. To churches, he spoke in images that burned. Children in townships, learning beneath leaking roofs, while white schools had swimming pools, men arrested for walking without a book of paper, women strip-searched for a pass stamp. He learned to make facts feel like bruises, and the facts were brutal enough to carry emotion without decoration. In South Africa, the police could arrest you for failing to produce a pass within minutes. Entire families were uprooted and dumped in barren homelands, their houses bulldozed like they were mistakes. Sharpeville wasn't an exception. It was a preview. Each time Oliver spoke, he saw two audiences. The one in front of him and the one back home, imagined, waiting for proof that their exile leader was not just surviving, but striking. Then, like a door slammed in the middle of a sprint, came the twist that rewrote the entire struggle. Rivonia. In 1963 and 1964, the regime captured key ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe leaders, Mandela, Sisulu, others. The trial that followed was designed not only to imprison men, it was designed to be a funeral for hope. Oliver was outside the country, which meant he was spared prison, which also meant he was now responsible for a movement whose spine had just been seized. He received the news like a punch to the lungs. Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment. Life, not a few years, not until elections. Life meant to erase them. That night, Oliver sat alone and stared at his hands. He had carried the ANC out of South Africa like a fragile flame, and now the wind had changed. The exile mission was no longer a supporting act. It was the center, and his competitor's argument returned with a cruel edge. If you had stayed respectable, if you had played inside the system, maybe your leaders wouldn't be on an island prison. Vusi didn't have to say it. London's polite circles whispered it for him. Oliver did not allow himself the comfort of self-pity. Instead, he did something harder. He reorganized his grief into discipline. He began to turn the ANC into a government in waiting without territory. He established missions, offices, a bureaucracy of resistance, because if you want the world to treat you like a serious alternative to apartheid, you must behave like one even while sleeping in borrowed rooms. He cultivated relationships with trade unions, student movements, liberation parties. He negotiated training and support for cadres, even as he tried to keep the ANC's image from being reduced to the word terrorist by apartheid propaganda. Here, the rivalry sharpened into something personal and dangerous. Vusi's camp offered Western governments a dream: controlled reform, stable capitalism, no disruption, no sanctions, no armed struggle. An apartheid-light future with a black face at the front desk. Oliver offered a different dream: a complete dismantling of white supremacy, one person, one vote, a South Africa that could not be managed by old elites. To some powerful ears, Vusi sounded safer. Safety was Oliver's enemy. He leaned into a weapon he understood: structure. He was not Mandela. He didn't have Mandela's theatrical charisma, but he had something that, in exile mattered as much as charisma, reliability. He could keep organizations from splintering. He could make people trust that the struggle had a brain, not just a heart. And exile tested that brain every week. There were fractures within the movement, arguments over ideology, over strategy, over who controlled funds, over who got sent abroad for training and who stayed in camps. Some recruits arrived starry-eyed and left bitter. Some were infiltrators. Some were broken by distance and boredom and the slow poison of waiting. Oliver became a man who spent his days in meetings and his nights in letters, writing, pleading, instructing, calming. He turned into the quiet father of a family that never stopped fighting at the dinner table. Then came another twist, one that would have crushed a weaker leader because it attacked the very image the ANC tried to project. Reports emerged from some ANC camps abroad. Harsh discipline, abuses, paranoia. The apartheid regime gleefully amplified every rumor, every scandal, every whisper of hypocrisy. Oliver understood the trap immediately. If he denied everything, he risked becoming the kind of leader who protects the movement's reputation by sacrificing its soul. If he admitted too much, he handed the enemy a weapon. His answer was not perfect, but it was consistent with the man who refused to sign a loyalty declaration at Fort Hare. Truth mattered, even when it cost. He insisted on inquiries, on internal accountability, on reforms. He took blows from both sides, those who wanted silence and those who wanted condemnation. In exile, he learned the hardest leadership skill, surviving not just the enemy's attacks, but your own side's disappointments. All the while, his deadline ticked inside him. That original 1 year had stretched into years, because history is cruel like that. But the sense of countdown never left. Every year, apartheid survived meant more children raised under its boot, more families torn apart, more graves without justice. So he kept pushing outward. He helped turn international opinion into something harder than sympathy. Sanctions, boycotts, isolation. He worked with allies to make South Africa's apartheid government feel the cost of its choices in trade, in sport, in culture. The regime could still brutalize townships, but it could no longer pretend to be a normal country among civilized nations. And this was where the rivalry became almost cinematic. Two South African voices abroad, two competing scripts offered to the world. Vusi in boardrooms, change will come if you cooperate. Oliver in packed halls, change will come if you resist. And if you make apartheid too expensive to maintain. Sometimes, after long days, Oliver would imagine the map again. The triangle, the lines straining. He would think of Mandela on Robben Island, breaking rocks under the sun. He would think of teenagers in Soweto who would soon face bullets. He would think of the ordinary people he could not protect directly, and he would feel the most terrifying pressure of all. What if exile turns you into a symbol, and symbols don't save lives? Then, in 1976, South Africa answered that question in blood. Soweto erupted after the regime tried to force black students to learn in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, poured into classrooms like poison. Children marched. Police fired. The image of a dying boy carried in the streets traveled across the planet like an electric shock. Suddenly, the world was listening again. And Oliver moved fast because he understood the moment's violence and fragility. Outrage is a wave. If you don't ride it, it collapses into the sand. He spoke until his voice roughened. He negotiated until his eyes ached. He received young exiles pouring out of South Africa, angry, grieving, ready to fight. He had to turn that anger into organization before it turned into chaos. The camps filled, the movement grew, the stakes rose, and with growth came a new danger. The apartheid state began reaching into exile with assassins, bombs, and infiltrators. Safe houses became targets. Friends became suspects. A car backfiring could make a room go silent. Exile had become a battlefield with no front line. Oliver started living like a man who might be killed without warning. Not because he sought martyrdom, but because his enemy had finally begun to understand him. He wasn't just surviving outside South Africa. He was making South Africa impossible to ignore. By the end of this stretch, years compressed into relentless motion, Oliver Tambo was no longer merely the man Mandela trusted. He was the axis holding the ANC together. The diplomat, the fundraiser, the disciplinarian, the emotional shock absorber, the architect of international pressure. The quiet boy, who once traced shapes in dust, was now drawing lines across governments. And the cruelest twist of all was that the better he did his job, the longer his exile lasted. Because every success tightened the regime's fear. Every alliance made apartheid more paranoid. Every boycott pushed it closer to the edge and made it more violent as it tried to hold on. Somewhere, Vusi's world of committees and gradualism still existed, still whispering to powerful ears. Give it time. Oliver no longer argued with that whisper. He drowned it with a single, relentless message, delivered again and again as if the world were a sleeping giant, and he had only his voice to shake it awake. Time is not neutral. Time is a weapon. And in South Africa, time was being used to kill. Word count, our length check, 10,500 characters, including spaces. The most dangerous thing apartheid ever did to Oliver Tambo wasn't to chase him across borders, or to brand him a terrorist, or to turn his name into a file in some intelligence office. It was to break his body at the exact moment the world finally started to bend. Because when the collapse begins, you don't get to pause. History doesn't wait for your heart to recover. And Oliver, who had spent decades building pressure like a man tightening a vice, suddenly had to fight on two fronts, against the regime and against the clock inside his own chest. By the early 1980s, the ANC in exile had become something apartheid could no longer dismiss as a romantic club of dreamers. It was structured, global, disciplined, an organization that could raise money in Stockholm on Monday, speak to presidents in Africa on Tuesday, and answer desperate messages from underground South Africa by Wednesday. That's when the regime shifted from mocking to hunting. Bombs, assassinations, cross-border raids, agents slipping into refugee communities like poison into water. Oliver learned to read silence the way other men read newspapers. Which comrade didn't show up? Which phone line suddenly sounded too clean? Which new face asked one question too many about travel plans? And always behind the noise, there was Vusi's competing tune. Now not just a rival philosophy, but a rival product being sold to Western capitals. Stability without upheaval. Reform without revolution. A moderate transition that would leave the economic structure intact and the old security men comfortably employed. Vusi's strategy came with a polished promise. We can talk Pretoria down. Oliver's strategy came with a warning that sounded to nervous ears like a threat. Pretoria will only move when it cannot breathe. The rivalry sharpened in private rooms where the air smelled of coffee and caution. Donors asked Oliver for assurances. Would the ANC protect property? Would it prevent chaos? Would it keep communists in check? Would it guarantee that South Africa wouldn't become another Cold War battleground? They didn't ask about children shot in townships. They asked about markets. Oliver answered anyway, because leadership in exile often meant swallowing your anger and weaponizing your patience. He would speak calmly, then drop a fact like a stone through glass. Forced removals, mass detentions, torture, disappearances, the apartheid state's endless emergency regulations that turned law into a mask for violence. He made them picture it. He made them feel it. He turned distant cruelty into a moral emergency that sat uncomfortably in the middle of their conference tables. And then, just as pressure was rising, his own body betrayed him. In 1989, Oliver Tambo suffered a stroke. Not a metaphorical one, not exhaustion. A stroke that stole the easy control of his movements, that forced his speech into careful territory, that made the act of simply standing up feel like negotiating with gravity. For a movement built on momentum, this was an earthquake. The twist was brutal. The man who had kept the ANC alive outside South Africa, who had been the movement's steady pulse, suddenly needed help to walk. The regime, in its cynical way, understood symbolism. It had always tried to present the ANC as a headless beast controlled by radicals. Now it could whisper another story. The exile leader is weakening. Time is on our side. Wait them out. And Vusi, still smiling in the polished world of gradualism, could sell an updated version of his old argument. See, the radicals can't even hold themselves together. Give Pretoria the respectable partners. Give them us. But Oliver refused to become a tragedy on schedule. Even as he recovered, even as his body demanded limits, he kept his mind at full stride. He delegated more, yes, but he did not disappear. He remained the moral center, the man whose presence reminded everyone what the struggle was supposed to be about. Not revenge, not a new elite, not a black version of white supremacy. Liberation that could survive its own victory. Then history flipped, fast, like a blade. The Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War cracked, and suddenly the old excuses for propping up apartheid, anti-communism, stability, strategic alliances, began to sound stale, even embarrassing. Governments that had treated the ANC like an inconvenience started recalculating in real time. Inside South Africa, the country was burning with organized resistance. Unions, community groups, youth structures, churches. The apartheid state could still kill, but it could no longer govern without constant emergency. It was spending legitimacy like a man bleeding money he doesn't have. And in 1990, the news hit like a drumbeat heard across oceans. Nelson Mandela was released. For Oliver, it was not a triumphant movie moment. It was a complicated, almost painful convergence of decades. The face of the struggle walked free, and the world's cameras locked onto him instantly, like sunlight finding a mirror. And there was another quieter truth. Mandela's release made Oliver's role both fulfilled and dangerously easy to forget. The movement now had its icon back on the ground, the man whose charisma could pull crowds like a tide. Oliver, still recovering, still largely abroad, risked being written into the footnotes as the caretaker, as if you could caretake an entire liberation movement across continents for 30 years. He didn't complain, he didn't fight for spotlight. That was never his war. But he understood something that frightened him more than personal erasure. In the rush to negotiate, people confused settlement with justice. The apartheid regime, cornered, began talking. Negotiations opened. Words like transition and new constitution appeared in the mouths of men who had once signed detention orders. The world applauded the dialogue and exhaled, eager for a clean ending. Oliver knew better. He had lived long enough to see how power tries to survive by changing its clothing. He returned to South Africa in 1990 after 3 decades in exile. Imagine it, a man stepping onto the soil of his own country as a stranger and a legend at the same time. Airports, crowds, songs that had kept his name alive while he slept in borrowed beds. Faces wet with tears, fists raised, and underneath the celebration, an ache. Because exile doesn't only steal time, it steals ordinary life. It steals the chance to be anonymous, to be simply a husband or a friend, to age quietly. His health made everything harder. His body, once the engine that carried him from capital to capital, now forced him to measure each day. He had a new deadline, more intimate than any political plan. How much strength was left? He became ANC national chairperson, a position of moral weight, in a movement now transforming from liberation organization into governing party in waiting. The battlefield was changing. No longer just sabotage and speeches and sanctions, but negotiations, compromises, internal discipline. The temptation of power. And that temptation created a new kind of rivalry inside the broader fight. A competition over the future itself. Some wanted a deal quickly to stop the killing. Others feared a rushed compromise would leave the old machinery intact. The police networks, the economic inequality, the quiet immunity for men who had ordered violence. Oliver stood in the middle of that tension like a man holding a fragile glass bowl while people argued whether to fill it with water or fire. He insisted on principle without performing purity. He was not naive. He understood that transitions are ugly and that peace often arrives with stains. But he also knew the danger of letting the country's rebirth be written by those most comfortable in the old world. And here came the strangest twist. After decades of fighting to be heard, Oliver now had to stop some people from speaking too easily, because moderation can become a trap when it means forgetting, when it means smoothing over the sharp edges of truth so the powerful don't feel accused. The negotiations continued, the violence flared, the headlines moved. Mandela became the global symbol of forgiveness and resolve. Around him, leaders like Walter Sisulu, Cyril Ramaphosa, Joe Slovo, and others shaped the shifting terrain. Oliver watched, advised, steadied, less visible, still essential. Then, in April 1993, as South Africa stood on the edge of its first democratic election, time claimed him. Oliver Tambo died on 24 April 1993, 1 year before the vote that would fulfill the mission he had carried across continents. That fact lands like a quiet punch. The man who held the struggle together long enough for victory to become possible did not live to watch the ballot boxes open. His death did not stop the story, because he had built the story to survive him. That was his kind of leadership. Not the kind that makes a movement dependent on one voice, but the kind that makes an idea durable. At his funeral, the country did what countries do when they realize, too late, that someone held them together in ways they never fully saw. There were speeches, songs, the formal language of tribute. But what mattered was the subtext humming beneath it all. He had been the bridge. When leaders were imprisoned, he was the link. When the world wanted excuses, he was the insistence. When exile threatened to rot the movement from the inside, he was the discipline. When rivals offered safe alternatives, he made safety feel like complicity. And his legacy isn't only political, it's structural and moral. He proved that diplomacy can be a form of warfare if you use it to isolate an oppressor instead of flattering it. He proved that a leader can be powerful without being loud. He proved that the most difficult kind of courage is the kind that doesn't get photographed. The courage to keep writing letters, holding meetings, settling disputes, raising funds, making calls, returning to the same argument for freedom until the world, finally, runs out of reasons to ignore you. If you want a final image to carry him with you, don't picture Oliver Tambo at a podium with microphones. Picture him late at night, in exile, in a room too small for the weight of his responsibility. A pen moving across paper. Not glamorous, not cinematic, and yet, in that scratch of ink, plans, instructions, appeals, strategies, there is the sound of a country being rebuilt before it is even free. Because the greatest twist in Oliver Tambo's life is this. He spent decades outside South Africa and still managed to shape what South Africa would become. Length check. 10 to 600 characters, including spaces.